I'm going to talk a bit more about secularisation in modern Britain and what the evidence shows us is happening. Now, just a little note here. I've been talking up till now about secularisation theories. Notice it's theories. You know, the idea there is a secularisation theory or something called secularisation theory isn't really true. There are lots of different theories of why secularisation happens. I suppose if you talk about secularisation theory, you just mean the idea that religion declines in modern societies. But the different theories have different ways of explaining why that is. Anyway, I've talked about theory. Well, theory isn't just based on evidence. Of course, it's got a relationship with evidence, but theory does something more. You know, it organises the evidence. It gives you a narrative. It gives you a picture. It gives you a map and a way of making sense of all the mass of evidence. So we can't ever really see any evidence outside of a theory. Theories shape what we see and how we understand, so they're really important. And theories aren't just proved or disproved by the evidence. They are a way of seeing it. So with the classical theories of secularisation, you wouldn't normally say, well, one of them's true and one of them's false. They reveal different aspects of the process of secularisation. Anyway, that's just a note about what a theory is. And the evidence is something different. We gather the evidence and then we have to make sense of it with a theory. Well, of course, sometimes the evidence will add weight to one theory against another theory. So what's the evidence in modern Britain telling us that's relevant to secularisation? There's a problem, even before I start to answer that question, and the problem is what evidence are we going to gather? And what questions are we going to ask? So one of the ways of gathering evidence these days is by having a poll, having a survey. We have our census every 10 years. Pollsters put out surveys all the time. Academics like me put out surveys and use pollster companies to administer those surveys. So we can very efficiently and quickly these days find out what people think. But what are we asking about when we're asking about secularisation? What are the little building blocks of evidence? You can ask somebody, are you religious or are you secular? But that's a pretty crude question. So what else can we ask about? Well, some scholars, and Grace Davie has popularised this idea, talk about three things. They talk about believing and belonging and behaving. And they point out that these are different dimensions or aspects of religion. So believing, that's obvious. That's believing in gods or believing in a doctrine, believing in a creed. Belonging, that's a bit more difficult. It's because it can mean actual going to church, or it can mean that you affiliate with a group. You know, you identify with it. So I might call myself Jewish, but never go to the synagogue, for example. So I'm affiliated, it's part of my identity, but I don't belong in the sense that I'm a member of that group. So that's belonging. And then behaving, that's obviously about our practices. Which practices? Well, it depends on the religion, doesn't it? So with a church, you can talk about church going. With Islam, you might talk about mosque going, but women are less likely to go to the mosque. So you might ask about how often people pray, or you might ask about various rituals they take part in. In Britain, you might ask, since it's historically Christian, do you go to church at Christmas? You know, you've got to find the right question to get at what kind of behaviour it is. I just want to mention one thing that I always think the BBB, behaving, belonging, and believing, misses out, and that is values and ethics. You know, it's a dimension of religion. It's not the same as religion, but often we think of that dimension. For example, when people say you're not a real Muslim, they're generally referring to the fact that someone's behaved in a way that they think is against the values of Islam, is unethical. So we might add values, although it doesn't begin with a B, unfortunately. So if we look at those sorts of dimensions, and what people do on surveys now is put them all together, so ask a whole lot of questions. To really understand religion, you've got to ask a lot of different questions. If you ask about those things, what does it show you for Britain? Well, as somebody like Steve Bruce, who puts all this evidence together to try and make the case for secularisation, as he shows, if you look at church attendance, there's no dispute, we've got very good data, there's no dispute that nearly all the big churches in Britain have declined dramatically since the 1970s. What about affiliation? People who say they're Christian, or Catholic, or Anglican, or Muslim, or whatever. Well, the number of people who say they're one of those things hasn't declined nearly as much as attendance. So just under half the population in Britain say they've got a religion. Nevertheless, that does mean that those who say they have no religion, when they're asked if that's an option, they've just recently, really recently, since about 2015, those saying no religion have become the majority. So that's a massive historical change from a Christian majority country for centuries and centuries to a non-religion majority country just in the last few years. Massive religious and cultural change. But still, affiliation is, still relatively high in this country. If you look at rituals, nearly everyone, 90% plus, used to be baptised in this country when they were born as an infant. These days, far, far fewer. It's collapsed. If you look at church weddings, they've declined much more recently. They've declined in the last sort of 50 years, really. And now people have civil ceremonies, or they have humanist ceremonies, and of course there are different religions that have their own sorts of wedding. So church attendance, rituals, those have all declined. And what about belief? What about believing in God? Well, that's much higher than practicing and going to church. But it's a very difficult question to ask. So you can't really just ask, do you believe in God? Yes, no. It's much better to ask, are you certain there's a God? Or is there definitely a God at one extreme? And are you certain there's no God at the other extreme? And then some options in between. Maybe, probably not, not sure. If you ask like that, on a scale, about a quarter to a third are atheists, so much more clearly secular, about a quarter to a third, and then fewer than that, maybe 15% are certain, think there is definitely a God. Most people are in the middle in this country. Maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't. So they run from probably there is to agnostic, I'm not sure. That's where most people in this country are. So to summarise that on belief, atheists are a minority, really passionate believers are a minority. Most of us are somewhere on the spectrum between, yes, I do think there's a God, but I'm not certain, to I'm agnostic, I just don't know. And that's where we mostly are. So to summarise that, and it is quite complicated, but to summarise, you can see there's no simple answer to are we religious or not. You have to break religion down into different dimensions like believing and belonging and behaving, and I haven't even talked about values, whether they're still Christian or not. And then for each one you've got to ask different survey questions, and then you need to think about all those things together. So it's not straightforward to say whether we are a religious or a non-religious country, but it is straightforward to say there's been very great decline in committed church belonging and attendance. The other really important point is that Britain's become much more diverse religiously, much more multicultural, much more multi-faith. So we are probably all familiar with people from different faiths and none. And that is leading to a change, not just in terms of the individual belief and the complexion of Britain. So, for example, Muslims now number about 5% of the population. It's the second biggest religion, and that's growing. So that makes a difference. But it also makes a difference at the political level and the societal level. It makes a difference to what politicians say, it makes a difference to policies, it makes a difference to how you teach religion in schools. All those things start to change as well. So the data, let's try and sum it up. There's a mixed picture depending which level of society you're looking at, which dimension of religion you're looking at, and indeed which religion, whether Christian or non-Christian. But the idea that the big mainstream churches that were dominant in this country for well over a millennium, the idea that they are declining has definitely been proved true by the data.